Can I maybe get a confirmation in chat that you can hear me? Those of you who are here, that would be great. Okay, thank you, Bhaskar. Thank you, Betty. Awesome. Okay, so I'm not exactly sure whether I'm supposed to start right away or wait a little bit. So I'm going to give it maybe like a minute. And if I don't hear anything from anyone, I'll just dive right in. So if you'll bear with me for just a little bit longer, just to be sure we're following proper protocol here. While we wait, if you wouldn't mind telling me where you're from, that would be awesome also. So I can acknowledge some time zones, maybe if it's much later for you than it is for me. India. Okay, so it is much later for you than it is for me. So India would be what, about, I'm guessing something like 1 a.m. in the morning. Is that possible? Yeah, okay. So kudos to you. Kudos to you. That's dedication right there. Chicago, Betty. Okay, thanks. Ecuador, Michelle. Yeah, awesome. Okay, so all over the place. Okay, so yeah, let's jump right in. Thank you for being here. So my name is Denis. I'm going to be your speaker for this session, and I want to start things off right away by talking about DEI. This session is going to be about disability, equity, and inclusion (DEI). But to talk about the gaps and the issues that we have with DEI. So you might be aware that most organizations out there these days are really pushing their DEI initiatives, their DEI efforts on very important topics like gender, sexual orientation, race, color, creed, religion, things like that. But there's one area where most organizations fail to include a group, a marginalized group, and that group are people with disabilities. So what I want to talk about today is that group and help you see how, as leaders in organizations, and by leaders I don't necessarily mean top level executives. I mean anyone who cares about making a change, bringing positive changes to their organization, to their workplace, can actually contribute to making the workplace, but the world in general, a much better and much more inclusive place. So there's a report that was handed out by a Report on Disability Group. That's a Canadian agency based in Toronto a couple years ago. And what they found out was that out of all the organizations that they had surveyed that had a DEI policy or some kind of DEI framework, only 4% of those actually counted disability as one of their protected characteristics. So everybody, of course, protects, color, gender, sexual orientation, all these different things, but disability is only actually accounted for about 4% of them. And 90% of the organizations that they had surveyed said that they had a DEI policy or some kind of a DEI initiative internally. So what that means basically is that when it comes to having a disability and working in an organization, you are likely very poorly supported. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, how many people with disabilities are there out there? And the reality is that when we look around the world, it's around 1.3 billion people across the globe. When we look at specific countries, like in North America, for instance, in Canada, it's roughly 22%. In the United States, it's roughly 26%. When you look at Europe in general, it goes around 20 to 25 in general. So all in all, most places, it's anywhere between, say, 18 and 25% of the population that self-identifies as having at least one disability that impacts how they lead their lives, how they work, how they go about their day. So a lot of those people are working, obviously, and what that means is that in the context of a workplace, chances are they are not getting the accommodations that they need in order to be able to successfully do their job, thrive, contribute to the full extent of their abilities to the organization. And what that means basically is that we are losing on that potential. We are losing on those ideas, the innovation that can come from those people, and we're losing on the talent as well as a result of that. So one of the things that I do in my business, Inclusive Communication, is I help organizations, I help leaders and organizations figure out how they can address disability inclusion as part of their efforts towards more inclusion internally. And recently, I was working on this document that speaks to the foundational pieces that you should do as a leader in an organization to help bring more inclusion to those who have disabilities. So that's what I want to share with you today. Is like these 15 keys, if you will, to bring more inclusion into the workplace for those who have disabilities. Now, I'm going to share a couple of documents with you as I'm going through this. I don't have slides to show, but I am going to share a handout with you in a couple of minutes. The handout basically will summarize what I'm about to tell you, and you can go and look into that a little more in more detail if you want to after the session. So basically, 15 ideas that you can practice, you can try to try and bring more inclusion into your workplace. The first one, probably very obvious, is understanding what disability actually means. So understanding that disability is much more than what we can visibly notice. That it extends into a much more diverse spectrum of challenges and conditions that people have that are either going to be cognitive, mental, health, or physical, auditory, visual, or mobility in general, like things like that. So better understanding what that means so that you can have a better understanding of who you're trying to serve with this group. So that would be the first place to start, is to do something like that. Look into the disability legislation that are in effect in your country. So for instance, in India or in the United States, for instance, in Ecuador, we all have different types of laws that speak to this. So again, because I'm North American, so that's what I know best. But the American with Disabilities Act in the United States is one such law that makes sure that we're not prejudicing against people with disabilities. We have something similar in Canada called the Accessible Canada Act. So those are examples of laws, and most countries have something like that these days. So it's either a mandatory law, it's either a policy, like there's something that basically protects the rights of people with disabilities on top of what you would have from the United Nations, for instance. That would be disability legislation. That's your second key that you should be thinking about. The third one is really about workplace accessibility. So, most organizations these days are pretty good, I would say, with the idea of being able to have a ramp in front of the building, or creating accommodations in the building, in the built environment, to help people in wheelchairs, for instance, be able to get around the area more autonomously. But beyond this, we have to think about the idea of pushing that further, so that anyone, regardless of the challenges that they might have, are able to function properly in our work of place of business. So depending on who works at your place of business and how what the building looks like, for instance, what the environment looks like, thinking about how we can make the workplace more accessible would be another really important thing to consider. Looking at the inclusive hiring practices, for instance. So how are you managing the hiring process? How are you managing the onboarding process for someone you've hired? Are those accessible to begin with? Are you providing accommodations to people who require them? Do they even have a chance or an opportunity to ask for those accommodations so that they can present themselves, at their best and provide the value that they could provide in the interview, by being properly supported with what they would need? You would be looking into things like etiquette, for instance. So from a disability standpoint, there are do's and don'ts in terms of how we speak, the words that we use, what is considered to be proper etiquette, for instance. So making sure that people are treated with dignity and respect seems like a given, but surprisingly, in our language, there are a lot of those words that are microaggressions for people who have disabilities. A bunch of words that we use all the time that we don't really think about are actually what we call ableist words. Ableism, much like racism or sexism, for instance, is a type of prejudice against, in this case, people who have disabilities. So how can we make sure that we learn about the way to properly address different situations when we speak to someone with a disability, when we speak about a disability, either in front of the person who has it or amongst other people who don't, so that there's always this level of respect being maintained through everything. Reasonable accommodations would be another one that we look into. So making sure that people have the tools that they need, the software that they need, the environment that they need, the adjustments that they require, so that they can successfully go about their day. In some cases, it might be a more flexible work schedule. In other cases, it might be the ability to work from home, or use your own equipment, or be provided with proper assistive technologies or other tools that will allow you to do your job. It might be making sure that the software that you have to use for work is something that you can actually use. Maybe you don't have the ability to use a mouse all that much. Is that software or that tool usable with only a keyboard if you're using a computer to use it, for instance? Like things like that are also things that you should be looking into to make sure no one feels excluded. Representation is a super important one. If you are thinking about someone who is looking at their leadership, for instance, and what they find out is that no one looks like them, no one seems to have a disability, like they automatically feel that it's not something that they could one day aspire to. So having proper representation, making sure that you have people, that you elevate people in your organization that also have disabilities, so that others can also feel like they could one day, maybe if they work hard enough, climb up the ladder and be someone who can do that. And then those folks, once they are in positions of authority, then they can also empower the workplace, the workforce, so that all these other things that I'm talking about actually come about as a better way to have a more inclusive environment. There's this concept called allyship. So being an ally to people with disabilities. So with disability, again, same kind of thing. You want to be able to learn about how you can be a good ally, so you're not constantly bringing people down without realizing it, but you're really supporting them in a way that works for them, or that is what they need. So getting training, getting educated on what those things are, learning, reading about how to be a proper ally, so that you can help use your privilege for the privileges that you have, so that you can help others grow and feel more welcomed, like they belong more in the workplace. If you're in a position of leadership, for instance, when you think about emergency plans or evacuation protocols, or any kind of emergency drills for if there's a fire or anything like that, are you thinking about this from the standpoint of accessibility? Are you thinking that if there's a fire, everybody needs to take the stairs, but if someone is in a wheelchair, how would they possibly do that? So how can you think, what can you do to make sure that if there's ever a situation that is an emergency like that, that everyone is cared for and everyone's well-being is valued in that sense? And again, as I was talking, only 4% of the organizations that do have a DI policy think about disability. So I've told you about 10 different things right now. And what that means is that for those organizations, none of this, or very little of this, is actually put into place, meaning that folks who have disabilities oftentimes feel like they're not really welcomed, or that they don't matter all that much, which of course impacts motivation and the drive to want to perform at work. A couple of other ones that we can think about in terms of keys relate to stigma and bias, for instance. So making sure that we actively seek out and eliminate any trace of bias, any trace of stigma when it comes to how people are treated, when it comes to the assumptions that we make about people and their abilities, what they can or can't do. Oftentimes, without even realizing it, it's not because people are mean or anything, but we just don't realize, and we make assumptions. Oh, so and so won't be able to do this because of X, and therefore we give them a simpler task, or we don't even consider them for a promotion because we're thinking they won't be able to do it. Well, in reality, they might very well be able to, but we never really give them a chance. So exploring what that looks like, and actively seeking those biases when we notice them, to try and change the dynamic around this. Another one is empowerment, self-advocacy, like helping people, like give people the means, the tools, so that they can start to speak for themselves and ask for things. Oftentimes, people with disabilities are going to mask, meaning that they're going to pretend like things are okay. They're going to not disclose something about them in fear of repercussion and in fear of stigma, again, and bias. So creating an environment where people feel safe enough to disclose different things and ask for what they need, in turn generates this snowball effect of more people coming out and actually asking for those things. And all of a sudden you start realizing that there are more people than you realized in your workplace of business that actually have disabilities. They were hiding in plain sight before that day. Inclusive communication is an obvious one as well. How words matter. So how we speak, the words that we use when we're communicating with our team, with our the larger larger population, speaks volumes to the values that we have internally when it comes to disabilities. Again, remember, if about a quarter of the population, a fifth of the population has a disability, and the way that you're marketing information or the way that you're communicating internally with your workforce clearly demonstrates that you don't really understand what their reality is, of course, people are not going to want to follow you, support you, do business with you, work for you. So learning how to communicate more inclusively is an absolute game changer in terms of making people feel welcomed internally. Mental health and disability. Recognizing disability as something to look into is already challenge enough, but mental health issues are even more difficult. Of all the different things that could be lumped into the umbrella of disability, mental health would be one that is even less recognized in most places. So how do we make sure that we're having conversations about mental health and we're normalizing the challenge that people face so that it's not taboo to talk about it, and you create this safe space where people are maybe not comfortable, but they feel safe enough to disclose the challenge that they're facing. And as an organization, as a leader in that organization, if you have that power, you support them so that they can work through what they're currently facing, or work around their challenges so that they can maintain either their employment or just go about their day while not having to feel awful because of how that impacts what they're doing. And then maybe another very important one, that would be my last key for today. A very important one also would be the intersection of disability and other things. So intersectionality is something that we've been hearing more and more in the past couple of years. Simply put, what that means is, someone with a disability will have a particular experience. And of course, every person with a disability will have their own experience that will, that will be a reflection of their reality. Two people that are blind are not going to go about their day the same way because they're blind, just like two people who are white are not going to about their day the same way because they're white. People have a bunch of other things that make them who they are. But beyond disability, the fact that you might be disabled and say be a person of color, or be a woman, or be someone who does not identify in the gender that they were attributed at birth, for instance, like things like that. That all compounds into something else that is going to be, again, different than just thinking, okay, so what do we do for John who's deaf, for instance? So it creates a lot more complexity. And really the only way to acknowledge that, again, is having open conversations, respectful conversations, creating policies that protect, make people feel like they're protected and respected. And all of those things, when you bring them together, do create a more inclusive environment, a more welcoming environment for people who have disabilities in general. So in a nutshell, that's what I wanted to share today. This idea that we need to open up to disabilities as a significant part of DEI. And I'll close the session by saying simply that if your DEI policy does not include disability, you're doing it wrong. If you are part of an organization that has a DEI policy, if you are part of a group that runs or helps with that DEI policy, and you are not paying attention to disability, you're missing something. There's something that's not quite there yet. You might be doing a lot of great things next to that, but you're still doing it wrong, and you're still failing a lot of people in the organization whom you may or may not know about because they don't feel safe to disclose their conditions, but they're there. I mean, we all have hiring policies that make sure that we don't discriminate. So we hire those people. Oftentimes, we don't even know that we hire them. If you think about different disabilities, like say, say dyslexia, for instance, that's roughly 17% of the population. A little over 20% of the population will have a learning disability, whether it's through reading or counting or other things. ADHD is a pretty popular thing these days. So attention deficit disorder, that's roughly 5% of adults that identify as having as being having attention deficit disorder. So those are just two examples of what we're talking about. And if you don't have something internally that helps them feel more comfortable in the workplace, despite the challenges that they face, then of course they're going to either hide or leave or disengage. And then we get into the whole conversation about quiet quitting, for instance, and people not really feeling that it matters all that much because people don't really care about them. So if we want to have a more successful workplace, if we want to have a more successful bottom line as a business, it's in our best interest to make sure that internally everyone works at their best, thrives as much as they can. And that, to me, includes making sure that disability is represented into our DEI efforts. So I'm going to stop there. We have about 9 minutes. I was thinking that maybe there would be questions or things like that. So I will, thank you. I'll stop here and see if we have any questions, if there's any conversation that we can have around this topic. Thank you. And I do see one in chat, so I'm going to start with that. Molly was asking, you mentioned that only about 4% of companies have DEI policies. What types of businesses are more likely to have them? It's a great question. I don't actually have that level of specificity in the data itself. But there's pretty obvious trends where, for instance, B corporations, corporations that have a strong corporate social responsibility policy will tend to have DEI policies as well. Organizations, like bigger organizations, typically will have them. But when it comes to those who have disability as part of what they're doing, they're typically going to be, places like government, departments or ministries or agencies, crown corporations in Canada, for instance. So organizations that are closer to the public that way, or banks or things like that, are going to typically have something around disability. But most organizations that are typically sued for accessibility, like say retail organizations, they typically won't have that as a general rule of thumb. Entertainment typically won't have that. Anything that's more popular, pop culture or artistic, like all these different things, typically we don't think about disability so much because we're focused on an experience that is either visual or very sensory, and we just don't consider the possibility that someone might not be able to enjoy what it is that we enjoy. The underlying message here is that one size doesn't fit all, basically never really fits all, and thinking that the way that we approach a service would work for everyone because we designed it in a way that we feel is good is just being misled, right? I mean, everyone is different, and as a result of that, like as an example, I'm colorblind, so I miss information on a daily basis when it's based on color. I see different colors, I don't really understand or can tell what they are. So if I need to identify a particular color to understand a concept, I'm typically unable to do that. But if someone designs pie charts, for instance, or graphs without considering what color blindness might have in terms of an impact, it prevents someone like me from reading the data and really getting to the bottom of it. So it goes back to inclusive communication in that case. But yeah, I mean, from my understanding, the organizations who tend to have disability as part of their DEI policies are the ones that are going to be much closer to like public services, for instance, or organizations that are closer to the public in the sense of wanting to do good by them. Those will typically have that, or when they're super highly regulated, of course, then that's also more likely to happen. Thank you for the question. So I do not see other questions. So I guess we're done, unless you have something else for me. That's what I had for you. So I did promise a couple of links to documents. I'm going to share that with you in chat. Let's see. Hopefully I can do that here. Dropping that in chat. So if you have access to chat, you can go first. You can go to this page. So that's a blog post that I wrote today I mean 2 days ago for today. It includes an overview of what I mentioned to you, and then this here, and I'm going to show it to you real quick. Hopefully I can do that too. So this is a handout that speaks to these 15 different keys. So let me see real quick if I can actually do that for you. Share screen. There we go. Okay. I'm going to share the entire screen. Can I share the entire screen? The window. There we go. That's what I want. Okay. Here. There we go. Okay. So this is the document I was talking about. So 7-page document basically speaks to these keys. So understanding disability legislation, so on and so forth. So those are all the different things that I mentioned. That's the second link that you have in chat. Feel free to read through it. Feel free to share it with other people. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions. I'll drop my my email in chat if anyone wants to reach out. There we go. And yeah, we're 4 minutes away from the end of the session. So maybe you've been hopping from one session to another. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes now of your life back if you want to do a quick bio break before the next one. And thank you for being here. Hopefully I'll get to talk to you at some point in the future. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks.